Good morning, everyone, and good evening and good afternoon to those of you who are here just after lunch in Europe. We have I'm very happy to see we have a very international group here today. We have participants from all over the world, men and women across government, businesses, maritime and non-maritime, as well as organizations. Very happy to see you here. And also today we are happy to welcome especially our speakers. So as you will see all of them on the screen here now. First we'd like to welcome Mr. John Bradshaw from World Shipping Council, sitting in Singapore. Mr. Hanqiang, the first Secretary Maritime for the High Commission of the Republic of Singapore. And then we have Bryan Wood-Thomas from World Shipping Council, and Simon Bergulf, who's Senior Director, ESG, Public and Regulatory Affairs for AP Moller Maersk. Personally, I'm Anna Larsen. I'm Communications Director for World Shipping Council, and happy to be with you today and will be moderating. So first, a couple of housekeeping matters. Feel free to be asking questions in the chat as we go along. We will take a couple of questions in connection with first John's presentation and then Bryan's, but most of the questions I will then leave for the panel discussion afterwards. And with that, I think we are ready to kick off. I will just close down the visuals here so that we get to only John for this one. Here we go. So John Bradshaw, he's our Technical Director for Environment and Safety. Today we will be discussing the next steps on the path to decarbonisation, and we will focus on the regulatory path. So at the IMO today, there are several proposals on the table heading into the key debates, and primarily then into MEPC 79. And John will kick us off by sharing what are those proposals and give some commentary on how they can be progressed going forward. John, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Anna, and thank you everybody who's joining us this evening. As Anna says, we're gonna give a quick presentation on the options that are available to the IMO. Wait a minute, I'm getting a technical fault message here. Am I still being received? I've got coming up. Okay, thank you. I'm getting messages that I can be heard, so I'll make a start. So the first slide basically summarizes that there's four principal proposals on the table. And the first one is the fuel levy / fee bit. The fee bit is a variation on the levy, which we're going to go into in the next talk. Can people see the slides now? Okay, that looks. I can see the slides on my screen now. Okay, we're getting some thumbs up, so I'll continue. So the first of the options is a fuel levy or a fee bit. The second is cap and trade emissions trading system, ETS. And both of these two proposals have really been advocated as part of a basket. The third one is a benchmarking proposal, and that's been put forward as an integrated measure, so very much a single standalone measure. And the final one we're going to consider tonight is a low greenhouse gas fuel standard. And that could either be a standalone measure or it could be part of a basket of measures. So if we go to the next slide, please. The first of the proposals to consider is the fuel levy stroke fee bit. And this is really probably the simplest of all of the options on the table. And basically each ton of greenhouse gas emitted, or alternatively each ton of fuel used on board, would incur a price. Whether the price is on fuel or the emissions doesn't really alter it. All it alters is the quantum you would pay, depending on whether you price the fuel or the greenhouse gas emission would alter the quantum, but it wouldn't actually alter the mechanism per se. The effectiveness of a levy would very clearly be dependent on the price. The higher the price, the greater the incentive to emit less. If the price is very low, there may be limited advantage benefit to emitting less. As I say, one of the key attributes of this is its simplicity. It's very simple in concept, very simple to understand. And a lot of the work to implement it has already been done. The basic architecture could be borrowed from the industry IMO IMRF proposal, which I'm guessing most people tonight are familiar with. That's a proposal to fund research and development. Two very important points are that there would be no price volatility. That's not to say that the quantum would be static. The quantum could be designed to increase, but the increase would be in a sequence of steps, and those steps would be predefined, and there would be no transport rationing. The fee bit proposal is a variation of the fuel levy, and it would work in a very similar way, but it's more targeted in terms of what it would achieve in terms of accelerating emissions reduction, how the money would be used, etc. So we've grouped it as a variation of the levy. The weakness of the levy is it doesn't mandate emissions reduction. In an extreme case, you might move the price model of marine fuel, but the industry would adjust and pay more. And that's why those that are proposing the levy have proposed it as part of a basket, and it would go very naturally with the fuel standard, and we'll look at that in a little bit later. So in summary, it's a simple option. We've already done a lot of the work. We could use the DCS for verification and implementation, and it does lend itself to forming part of a wider basket. Next slide, please, Anna. So the next one we'll consider is cap and trade stroke ETS. This one's more complicated, but I'm guessing many of you tonight will be familiar with the concept of an ETS, emissions trading, given that it has been implemented for land-based emissions in quite a number of regions and countries. And in this system, we would have an emissions cap, and ships would have to surrender emissions permits for any greenhouse gas emissions in that reporting period. So it's important to stress that this is not a very mature proposal in terms of IMO. Although it's been proposed, the proposal on the table leaves a lot of questions unanswered. But it's anticipated we would see both a primary and a secondary market for trading the ship emission units. For the trading, there's actually quite a number of variations how this could be implemented. And we've listed some of them on the slide. So we could see full auctioning with no price control. We could see full auctioning with a price control, so that would be a ceiling and or a floor to limit the price fluctuation. There could be some sort of partial auctioning, and there could be a free allocation approach. It's important to say that at the moment there's been no discussion on how it would be implemented. All we have is a proposal that an ETS should be considered. A further aspect which is still open to debate is whether it should be an open system, which means the emissions units could be traded between segments, or whether it should be a closed system, i.e. it should be purely within the shipping sector. At the moment, it seems that those proposing it see it more as a closed system initially, with the potential to open later on. One of the concerns with this particular proposal is the question of transport rationing and price volatility. We don't think that transport would be rationed if the mechanism was well designed and properly thought out. Now that I appreciate that's quite a significant caveat, but we are quite confident that providing an ETS was properly designed, we see minimal risk of transport rationing. By transport rationing, what that means is, well, what happens if the industry runs out of credits before the end of the year? Would we have to lay ships up to the start of the next reporting period? It is a concern, but we think it's not the concern that some have presented. And the main advocate at the moment for this, Norway is a strong advocate, and Europe has also shown positivity. One further thing that's still to be expanded upon is whether this would work on the basis of tank-to-wake emissions or well-to-wake. Norway has proposed tank-to-wake initially, with scope to expand to well-to-wake once the life cycle analysis guidelines are finalised. So I guess the main takeaway for this slide is a lot of work's necessary. It's still a very immature proposal, and at the moment nobody really has any visibility how a global ETS could be implemented for a global industry like shipping. Next slide, please, Anna. The next proposal was proposed by a group of member states, including China, and this is a benchmarking principle. And this one's actually quite complicated, and I think there's been a lot of discussion about this one because it is something that needs a little bit of thought to understand. Something that the proponents have stressed is it would require ships to make a payment based on the actual emissions, but those emissions would be benchmarked against the carbon intensity indicator reference lines, which is a transport work metric. So that means essentially we would be mixing aggregate emissions with a rate of discharge metric, and that's quite complicated, and I think it needs further consideration. So what this means is that very high performing ships that are going to receive an A or a B rating in the CII mechanism that starts next year, would be rewarded. The lower emitting ships, those that are rated D or E, would pay into the fund that would reward the A and B ships. And the ones that are on the reference line, they wouldn't be rewarded, but they wouldn't be liable for a payment either. So what's important to recognise is essentially the lowest performing ships would be paying they would be the ones paying the money for the reward. It's linked to an integrated, it's presented as an integrated measure, so it's part of an international maritime sustainability funding and reward mechanism. And I think the key is the reward, and the proponents advocate that this would tie in the greenhouse gas intensity of fuel. It would incorporate the financial measure, and it would push emissions reduction. The proponents are quite positive that there would be no risk of transport rationing, as we've already discussed. The sort of weakness is at the moment it's very unclear whether the price gap between fuel and alternatives would be closed, because we anticipate the difference in price between the low emission fuels and, for example, heavy fuel oil would be very significant. And at the moment it's not clear whether this would be sufficient to make low emission fuels viable. And it's still unclear how it would work in practice to mix aggregate emissions with a rate of discharge reference line. As proposed, it's not clear whether the level of ambition would be suitable. However, it's important to recognise that it is a positive proposal that's been made by quite a large group of member states, including several of the BRICS countries. And although it's a complicated proposal, certainly relative to a levy, we consider it as a rational and logical mechanism, i.e. if properly designed, it could work. However, one of the concerns we have is the use of a CII metric, and we think it could be improved somewhat if it was reconfigured to use a life cycle analysis metric. Next slide, please, Anna. So the final one of the four proposals we have in front of us is the low greenhouse gas fuel standard. And this would actually be much more of a regulatory mechanism. It's not a financial instrument, although there is a financial element to it. And this would very straightforward. It would require ships to use energy fuels with a defined welterweight greenhouse gas intensity, and it would define a limit for that in terms of grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule. It would be strengthened in a series of steps, so recognising that we have a big transition and we can't make it in one step. The proposal would see a series of steps. So it would start perhaps quite modest and then steadily increase in ambition. and it includes an alternative compliance mechanism. So if you overachieve, i.e. you emit less in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule, you would get a credit for the following year. If the ship doesn't comply, then it could pay into a fund, so effectively you could pay to bring the ship back into compliance. And that's why, although this isn't a financial measure, there is a financial component. It would mandate emissions reduction, but it doesn't address the price difference between fuel oil and alternatives. And this has been proposed in great detail by the European Union member states. And it could be a complementary measure to either an emissions trading scheme or a levy. And possibly it could be taken forward on its own if IMO can't get agreement to develop a financial instrument. I think if we look at this one, it's very easy to see why this could complement an ETS or the levy, because, for example, if you have the levy, you close the price gap, but you don't mandate emissions reduction. The fuel standard doesn't address the price gap, but it does mandate emissions reduction. So there is a synergy there, and also with an ETS potentially. Next slide, please, Anna. So I think we're all expecting IMO to develop a basket of measures because we've already discussed tonight that some of these measures could actually be very complementary and work very well together. And we are very happy with this concept, but it's important to ensure that the measures are reinforcing and that we don't build any conflicts into a system. So it's very good if we have measures that complement each other, but it would not be very good at all if we end up with measures that are conflicting. And if we look at the two natural combinations of the levy and the fuel standard, or the fuel standard with an ETS. As I've already said, if we look at the benchmarking proposal, that's actually sold as an integrated measure. So if that one was taken forward, the proponents have been quite clear that they see that as a standalone measure that already addresses everything that needs to be considered. And with that, I think I can hand back to Anna. That's just a very brief introduction summary of the principal options that we'll consider when IMO meets in December. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So we move on to the next part of the program. Now we know what proposals are before the IMO. And to support this work, most of you will have seen that we have submitted a paper, the MEPC 79.7. And I'll put a link towards the end for downloading that in the chat. That goes through these proposals and also highlights some of the key suggestions we have as WSC for swift progress. So I will now invite Bryan to please join us again to explain these for us.
Thank you, Anna. If you want to pull up the slides, I'll get started.
Yes. You go ahead. They'll be up in a minute.
So in terms of the challenges we face, one of the aspects we would like to emphasize is the fact that we need a set of enabling conditions for this major energy transition to occur. Next slide, Anna. In the previous MEPC session, we identified what we referred to as 6 critical pathways. In essence, we are looking at a major energy transition, not only in the maritime sector, but there is a set of interconnected relationships with other sectors across the world's economy that come to play to make this transition work. In the paper submitted to 78, we identify the 6 pathways noted below. I will very quickly just touch upon those 6, and we can answer any questions that do come back relative to those. First, we believe a global carbon price is necessary. Why? In short, the differentials, the cost on an operating basis, even setting aside capital investment, of using the most attractive fuels, and when I say the most attractive, those with the lowest greenhouse gas profile, fuels we call near zero, the cost differentials are expected to be very, very high compared to using conventional fuel. So if one wants to be a first mover and you are going to make investments and you're able to secure the fuels you need, your operating cost will be dramatically higher. Consequently, a carbon price is a very important aspect to make use of these more attractive fuels sustainable in a commercial context. Secondly, fuel life cycle. John touched on differences in some of the proposals as to whether they are looking at a fuel from a tank to wake basis, namely what is the greenhouse gas profile of a fuel strictly once it's on board the ship, versus a well to wake analysis, which looks at the greenhouse gas profile of the fuel and its use from production all the way through use. This is particularly important because some fuels will have very attractive tank to wake profiles if you ignore the well to wake life cycle analysis. This is a concern to us because what you want to do is not send a market signal to encourage the use of a fuel that actually has a very high greenhouse gas profile, if in fact it happens to have a low profile once on board the ship. So this is another very critical component, and many of you are familiar with the discussions and work underway on fuel life cycle analysis. Fuel supply development. One of the matters that perhaps receives inadequate attention in this debate is that the production of the most attractive fuels in a green context, i.e. production of near zero fuels, will require massive investments to convert energy production using renewable energy. This matter does not get a tremendous amount of attention today, but this is critical to the production of these fuels with the kind of greenhouse gas footprints that are needed to actually undertake a full transition. So this is This is really important. Green corridors. Many of us have seen announcements for various stakeholders announcing their interest in participating in a green corridor. Green corridors where you have the ships capable of using lower energy fuels and where lower greenhouse gas profile fuels are in fact available, provide a very useful mechanism for this transition across the world, and I'll speak more to that in a moment. Finally, we have two other aspects here. IMO will once again be debating what the next round of new build standards should be. We believe we should be looking at new build standards relative to our ambitions, not simply in improving efficiency, but what is a new build standard that makes sense relative to this fuel transition that we're looking at. And finally, R&D investment remains critical, especially applied R&D, because some of the fuels, many of the fuels that are being examined for future use have significant issues that require applied research to resolve. Many of you are familiar with the issues surrounding ammonia. It's toxic, it's corrosive. One has to develop engineering systems to handle that in a manner that is almost fail-safe. Other fuels have other characteristics that require management as well. So I'll leave it at that as these enabling provisions, the critical pathways we've identified. Next slide, Anna. So building off the characterizations, the observations that John has made on the proposals in front of the IMO today, and looking at the paper we just submitted last month to the IMO for MEPC 79, we've made 3 recommendations for the consideration of the member states and others at the IMO as to changes, modifications that we believe would enable the IMO to move faster and more efficiently. The first concerns the greenhouse gas fuel standard. We're quite positive on the concept of a greenhouse gas fuel standard, namely because it directly addresses the core issue, namely transitioning to low and near zero greenhouse gas fuels. That's fundamental, and we believe a greenhouse gas fuel standard directly addresses this fundamental issue. The current proposal proposes 6 different steps every 5 years with successively lower greenhouse gas content requirements. We believe we can move faster and more efficiently with 2 or 3 steps. Energy production is a difficult process to manage on 5-year increments. And with a very large number of increments, we believe we might end up stalling or making this process less efficient. And if we move with fewer steps that coincide with some substantive analysis of the production marketplace, we believe we can actually accelerate the transition and reach the same goals sooner, or at least more efficiently. Secondly, green corridors. touched on those a moment ago. One of the things I think it's important to recognize is this energy transition across the globe will require massive investments in new fuel production methodologies, as well as the infrastructure for the different fuels that end up being the most promising candidates. It is difficult, very difficult, to imagine that that transition happens uniformly and at a single point in time across the globe. The level of investment is just huge, and we have very significant differences in economies around the world. Green corridors present two opportunities. One is it's a place to establish experience with the use of new fuels and to allow first movers to have the conditions to use these new fuels and to introduce the ships capable of using them. There has also been a tremendous amount of discussion at the IMO about equitable transition. Green corridors can also serve as a very significant mechanism for issues of equity. Green corridors can be established between developed and less developed countries with explicit programs that enable this transition to occur in different places around the globe in an organized manner. And for this reason, we are suggesting that IMO explicitly incorporates green corridors with criteria. You just don't get to call a corridor green. There has to be fuel availability. There has to be other conditions stipulated, but that these corridors can be incorporated and integrated into the strategy of the IMO, and we believe that can be very helpful to this transition. Finally, our third suggestion concerns the benchmarking proposal. Today, the benchmarking proposal is benchmarked off the carbon intensity indicator, CII metric, developed by the IMO that looks at a proxy for transport work. As John pointed out earlier in his remarks, this metric is complicated. It's highly influenced by a lot of external factors. And it's ultimately influenced, or if you will, in some ways diluted as transport work around the world increases. Consequently, we believe a benchmarking approach will work better if the metric is literally the greenhouse gas intensity, the emissions of the ship directly. Today, the benchmark assigns, if you will, funding consequences, penalties to ships that are rated low on the CII. It's not technically a carbon price across the fleet because other ships that are emitting very significant amounts of carbon do not encounter any carbon price. However, if you adjust the benchmarking proposal to be a well-to-wake LCA intensity-based metric, we believe that particular approach improves notably. I'll leave my remarks to that and turn it back to Anna, and we can have a broader discussion. Thanks very much.
on screen. I will also soon be inviting the rest of the gang in again. I wanted to first pick up one of the questions that came in through the chat. Stian Akre is wondering about a fuel levy and if putting the levy on the fuel rather than the emission, if that would mean that you would discard reductions obtained by onboard CCS.
One, I think that's a very good question. In terms of one of the things we've long discussed is that a levy is at its base best constructed from an emissions standpoint. Generally, the most convenient mechanism for translating emissions is the conversion for the fuel you're using. And that's the approach many of the players have discussed. The question raised certainly is one that has to be looked at carefully once you introduce carbon capture. But I would defer to Simon, John, others, whatever remarks they might have on this particular matter.
Simon, any thoughts on your end on this specific question?
Yeah, thank you. And it's a very good question, but it's a manageable question, so to say. You know, when we see how the ETS is built up or how a levy is built up, if we have carbon capture on board, there will be a method, obviously, of checking that and enforcing that and seeing how it's working, right? So I do believe that there would be a possibility to have some sort of exemption or lowering of the levy. I mean, it's down to actually a situation whereby we have to make sure that the regulatory framework follows what's going on out in the real life in the science. Right? It's not more different than making sure that it actually also follows new fuels that are being put on the market, which no one had heard of only a few years ago. So it's a good point, but I do believe it's manageable.
Very good. Welcome to the panel part of this webinar. We've learned that there are a number of different proposals on the table, and the IMO needs to take a very good look at that. Hanqiang, if I could start with you, what do you see as the most important focus areas in the IMO going forward to make sure that we're making progress?
Thank you, Anna, for the question, and thank you to our presenters, Bryan and John, as well, for the presentations. I think there are basically, two key areas of focus, and they're very broad, I must say, areas. I think the first is about correctly incentivizing the uptake and production of alternative fuels. I think this was already identified. And of course, this then goes to the perennial chicken and egg problem. How are we gonna, stimulate this sort of production and uptake? And the reason why I use the word correctly incentivizing is because, referring once again to the presentations, I think LCA is another important aspect of this, because we want to ensure that the accounting is done correctly. You don't want to create perverse incentives where you result in larger emissions on the land side in the end. So that's one broad area in terms of correctly incentivizing the uptake and production of alternative fuels. And I think the other broad area of focus that really needs to be discussed is how do we balance ambition with impacts on states? And that's, I guess, a more political sort of question, but ultimately it's something that needs to be answered by member states. So how are we going to balance the stringency of the measure against the impacts on states, and how we're going to mitigate and analyze those sort of impacts. So I think these are the two broad areas that really need to be tackled, probably simultaneously, given the urgency of the climate action that's required. And certainly it's something that the IMO will be discussing in starting this December in MEPC. Thank you.
Interesting. Simon, Maersk is already investing heavily in vessels that can run on methanol. You are helping set up production, cooperating with methanol producers to ensure supply, from going back to what Hanqiang mentioned. So there is apparently some pretty fast progress, even with not that much greenhouse gas regulation in place today. So how important is that actually? Can't industry sort of pull this on its own?
Yeah, I've heard that comment made a few times now about, is it really necessary to have regulation? And I'd like to dismiss that immediately. It is imperative to have regulation. It's absolutely necessary. And the fact that industry, in this case, in certain parts of industry, Maersk and a number of other ship owners are heavily investing, and we feel very honestly that sometimes the regulation is lagging a little bit behind, doesn't mean that there's no need for regulation. It just means that the regulation, in a sense, needs to catch up and be there to support what is going on. Shipping is right now facing what we would call a Kodak moment, or we would call, a shift to the internet moment. The worst thing that we can do is do nothing. Like, that is for sure a death sentence over some of the companies here if we just sit back, relax, and don't do anything. We face a climate urgency, we face a customer demand and investor demand, and therefore we have to do something. So that's why we're acting. But the regulation is there to, I would say, give the rules of engagement to us and make sure that you actually lift the bottom part of the industry as well. So otherwise we won't be able to compete, even if we are ahead right now.
Thank you. Bryan, going back to the well-to-wake life cycle perspective, because that's something that's very much under discussion these days. Why is that so important, and what would it mean in practice if you implement it for the benchmarking regulation, for example?
Thank you, Anna. With respect to the benchmarking regulation, that proposal today is premised on the CII being the, if you will, bench. And in short, we believe the most efficient way to address this energy transition is literally the greenhouse gas emissions produced by a given ship or group of ships. Using the CII complicates that equation. And as noted in the earlier remarks, we see a situation where financial implications fall on a portion of the fleet, but not even all of the fleet. We believe if you use this life cycle analysis as the benchmark, that its actual greenhouse gas intensity of the ship in absolute terms, that it will be more efficient. Happy to elaborate. Others on the panel can as well, but I'll leave it at that for the purposes of brevity.
Thank you, Bryan. We've also been talking about green corridors, and it's also something we see quite a lot in the media, and it's part of the proposals. Hanqiang, Singapore has a rather unique position today when it comes to it's very much a fuel hub, and recently also signed an MOU with Rotterdam to establish a green corridor, a green shipping corridor. Do you see a role for the IMO in such green corridor initiatives? And in that case, what could that be?
Thank you, Anna, for that question, and thank you for also recognizing the green corridor that we just signed with the Port of Rotterdam. We're very excited about that. I think in terms of the IMO, we definitely, as a start, we definitely see that the IMO has a very strong facilitative role in creating green corridors. And for these reasons, actually, we do have a joint initiative with the IMO that's already underway. It's called Next Gen Connects. I don't know how many of you will be familiar with it, but basically it's a challenge statement that we've put out for stakeholders to propose route-based action plans. So essentially green corridors on how to reduce GHG emissions between ports between port countries in the Asia Pacific region, and the intention is really to for this winning proposal to be implemented on a pilot basis with global partners together with the IMO. And so this is, I think, a first step, and it's something that we have an interest in, and we have taken up with the IMO together in partnership. But looking ahead, I think the IMO is in a very unique position in two ways. I think the first is that because it's the global standard, global shipping standard setting body, it has the potential to perhaps set some sort of standardized frameworks for these sort of green corridors. I think Bryan had mentioned, perhaps some basic definitions as a start, to understand how this can be done. Of course, information sharing is another aspect as to how best practices from one green corridor could be applied to another. Of course, that's another way. And the second key way, I think, is really to enable closer cooperation between developed and developing countries. Once again, this is actually what Bryan had mentioned as well, whereby green corridors can actually also help to facilitate technical cooperation and knowledge transfer between different regions. And so these are areas where I think the IMO has a very unique position and, in fact, strengths that it can leverage off. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the question that's come in the chat from Justin Stairs, asking, to what extent are the IMO's hand tied by what's happening in Brussels? For example, surely any IMO fuel levy would not be compatible with the EU ETS. Bryan or Simon, would like to comment on that?
Anna, I'm happy to make a few initial remarks. I'm sure others will have more to add. First, thank you to the question and the remark from Justin. It's a very pertinent question. First and foremost, as most players, participants on this call recognize, the European Union has really tremendous influence on the debate in London because it has the power of 20-some votes. So no significant contentious matter escapes this issue of what is the EU's coordinated view. Is the IMO's hands tied? My simple answer is no. The reach of the EU regulations that are under debate and finalization in Brussels does certainly complicate the issue. The EU's regulations have been explicitly designed to reach extensively across the globe by virtue of the geographic scope. But the EU and the Commission knows very well it is not a fully global solution. And they very much so appreciate the necessity of global solutions. I think, and based on informal commentary and matters under discussion, I believe, with respect to your specific question, Justin, that the EU may be quite open-minded to what types of approaches may be viable at the global level, and that I don't think excludes a levy in combination with other measures. I think we're going to see a lot of discussion about a combination that might involve a low greenhouse gas fuel standard and some other market instrument, whether that is a levy or some other variant. So the short I guess, perspective is I don't think it ties IMO's hands. The EU greatly influences the debate, but our hope and expectation is the EU will be more open-minded than some might imagine about what makes sense globally. A discussion across the entire globe with an extremely diverse set of countries requires creativity and flexibility to come to solutions. I suspect Simon can offer a very close to home perspective on this matter as well, and invite Simon to elaborate.
Sure, and thanks for the question, Justin. As always, a very pertinent question, and I might be a little cheeky here and revert it to you. Does it tie the EU member states' hands? Right. That's also a question that's worth asking yourself, right? If we have the situation that we have now and the progress that we're having at EU, does that actually tie the EU member states' hands at IMO? And I don't think it does. I agree with Bryan. I mean, my main worry going into this was, will this lead to a lowering of the activity and the engagement of EU countries at IMO? Will the focus be only on what's happening in Europe? And so far, I'm really pleased to say it hasn't at all. So, in that sense, we still see a very strong engagement by European countries in the IMO discussions, as should be the case. I think we'll have a number of systems running in parallel for a while. We do talk about sunset clausing in the European and the regional scheme, but let's be honest, and we will probably have some parallel systems for running, but they are, again, it's a manageable problem. What we just need to do is avoid double counting. We just don't need to put carbon price twice on the same emissions, but it's manageable. But it also goes back to the fact that we need the good, the accurate data, and we need a really excellent data set to base this on. And that's actually, for me, a bigger concern, whether it's ETS or Levy, is if we're counting differently.
Thank you, Hanqiang. I believe you had something to add as well.
Yeah, no, I'm just in full agreement with the prior speakers. I think based on my experience at the IMO, the European representatives here are fully engaged, and they are actually constructive. And so even though we are aware of these parallel developments in the EU, I think, like Bryan said, they're well aware as well of what's happening at the IMO, and ideally there won't be any sort of overlap in an ideal world, but maybe there might be for a short period of time. But what Simon said, what's most important is that you don't get things like, and also what John said, conflicting sort of regulations. Minimally you want some sort of at least agreement in terms of data, in terms of what you're regulating at the very baseline. And once again, I do think that the European colleagues at the IMO are very constructive and helpful for the most part. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question here in the chat from Ida Valar. How long does the shipping industry actually have to get these levies or regulations into place before it's too late, so to speak? Simon? Can I?
Not long. Yeah, not long. And that's why it was so important for us in the World Shipping Council and with my peers and competitors to come forward with this critical pathway initiative that Bryan also presented. We need to move forward now, and the carbon price is one of the core elements of that. Things are happening very, very fast. And if we already have the first vessels, to take the example from Maersk, but there could be also examples from some of the other big ship owners, the new vessels on the seas within a couple of years, that means that already there, ideally, we need some form of mechanism to help support that and further the transition. So, if I'm a very optimistic person, I can hope to have a carbon price by 2027. If you ask me my guess, and today I'm in a very good mood, so that would be my guess. But that would mean really engaging very, very quickly now. And that's why the meeting in December, but not least the meeting MEPC 80 is going to be both going to be absolutely fundamental.
Thank you. We are at the end of our scheduled session. So I would like to first thank everyone for attending. A great big thank you to our speakers. And want to ask you if you have any closing comments. Bryan, maybe you can start by addressing the key questions. With all the different proposals before the MEPC 79 and still a very wide range of opinions, can we expect progress? Can we expect fast enough progress?
I do expect progress. I think there's two things, one procedural and one substantive, that we need to caution ourselves against. Each time we go into an MEPC session in London, there's usually considerable commentary about how X decision or et cetera needs to occur, or we are on a disastrous pathway. I think any of us who have worked in global negotiations know it is incredibly difficult and challenging to reach global agreement on issues that are inherently complicated and controversial. So we have to be realistic about how those agreements evolve and the kinds of discussions that need to take place for things to come together. The more substantive issue I think we all need to be also cognizant of is this transition, for it to be fully successful, requires a transition to the most promising fuels, those that have near zero greenhouse gas footprints. One of the ways these discussions can stall or go sideways is if we set up a platform that encourages modest improvements, but really stalls us on sitting in those modest improvements and not moving to the fuels and technologies that really offer dramatic reductions. And I think we need to bear that in mind throughout these discussions, that we create a structure that enables that and that we don't get stalled. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you. Hanqiang, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess just generally, I've said this before as well, and I think we're going to enter a time of immense, what I would say, messiness. There's going to be multiple fuels on the market. There may be different regulatory systems, a bit of an overlap. But I don't think we should be dissuaded or afraid of this. I mean, it's the nature of every transition or Kodak moment, as Simon aptly puts. And in fact, we should just take the challenge by the horns and we just give it our best shots. And I'm very sure that we'll pull through in the end. So I'd like to end on an optimistic note. Thank you.
Thank you. Simon?
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to what's been said both by Hanqiang and Bryan, because those were excellent points. I think just to lift it up a little bit in a helicopter view and beyond just shipping, we are at a time where we're looking to rewrite the whole global energy map. I've, as you said, Anna, we've had a number of discussions with energy providers of these new fuels, and some of them have been very honest with us and said, you know, we've always been frustrated by the fact that we just couldn't drill in the ground and become a rich country, so to say, due to what's in the underground. But now we can see that we are some of the best placed countries in terms of wind and solar, and those countries will really benefit from this transition. And that goes a little bit to one element that we haven't spoken about much today, but that's the where does the money go, right? Where does the money go from carbon pricing, which is an important discussion that we need to have, and linked to the equitable transition that we also talked about. And all these elements needs to play together. But when we look at the new fuels that we need for shipping, we're moving away from sailing on a, on a fuel that couldn't really be used for any other purposes to sailing on a product. So suddenly there's obviously an offtake there. There's a big market to be gained there. And as such, I would say that the eyes of the producers and of different countries are going to open very soon to see how much there is there. And so I would also end on a positive note and expect that this production is going to ramp up really quickly. I don't think that we are anywhere close to understanding how quickly the green fuels are going to ramp up, provided that the right infrastructure and regulation is put in place for the production of green electricity. And that to circle back, that's where the money should go, of course. So that would be my end note on this, and also thank you very much for having me. And if there are any other questions that we haven't had time to address, of course, people are very free to contact me.
Thank you, and thank you very much for everyone who attended today. It's been great to have you all. Again, a special thank you to our speakers, and this session has been recorded, so you will receive a link by email afterwards if you want to go back and listen again, or if you want to share with someone who wasn't able to join us. We will continue to invite for dialogue and discussions to keep progressing this move to decarbonize shipping, and we look forward to seeing you again and speaking with you again in a webinar or in live format shortly. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.